Welcome to everyone. I'm Selin.
And I'm Ileana, and this is our first podcast episode of our podcast, Çağ Akarken, which is originally a podcast in Turkish. I think we have like 6 or 7 episodes, I'm not sure. So we started 2 years ago on the 8th of March, and we decided to make it also, like record it also in English, because why not? One was not enough. It was not hard enough to record it, to edit it, so we decided to make our lives a bit more difficult. So on the original one, we started the podcast with Sappho. So that's why today we will also discuss about Sappho. Well, that will come, actually. I don't want to spoil everything. So Selin, please take the floor.
Okay, thank you, Elena. So before I take the floor, I'll pass the word to Baudelaire. I will mention 2 lines written by Baudelaire on the island of Lesbos, the place where Sappho was born and where she lived. Afterwards, we hope that we can accompany Baudelaire on this lonely path and pay tribute to Sappho and the other women of Lesbos. Baudelaire says, "For Lesbos chose me among all other poets to sing the secret of her virgins in their bloom. Let us hope that Lesbos has chosen us, along with Baudelaire, to sing this secret, because both Elena and I are people of action rather than inaction. No matter what we do or what we feel, we are people who feel that nature is in motion and passes by. That is why Sappho touched us, as well as nature itself touched her, and I hope she touches you in the same way."
So now I would like to provide some information about Sappho. Her birth and death dates are not entirely clear. It is said that she was born between 630 and 612 BCE. There's also a more specific date around 615 BCE. Her death is estimated to have occurred between 570 and 50 BCE, possibly in her 50s or 60s. Sappho was born on the island of Lesbos, and she was born into an aristocratic family. But we have very limited information about her life, in a matter of fact. So we know that she had brothers because she mentions one of them in one of her poems, talking about his distress over a woman he loved. Therefore, we have this piece of information. Sappho was an important poetess in her time. She also had an interest in music, which was not an uncommon match in ancient Greece. Poetry and music often went hand in hand, and we can consider Sappho the founder of lyrical poetry. She established prosody unique to herself and played the lyre, which accompanied her poems. When we look at Sappho's poetry, we see that she didn't just worship the gods. She expressed her own emotions, life experiences, sorrows, disappointments, and her relationship with nature in her poems.
I think that already in that period, even at feasts, there might be women or men singing poems with the lyre.
As you mentioned, the lyre was a common instrument in ancient Greece and often accompanied poetry. So, in terms of content, lyrical poetry stands out from epic poetry or other genre. Before we continue, I want to highlight something about Sappho. She wasn't the only poetess on the island of Lesbos. Besides Sappho, there are 2 other poets we know of because they are mentioned in Sappho's poems. So they are Andromeda and Gorgo. We can say that they were in a kind of competition because Sappho engaged in poetic contests with them.
There are some verses written with a bit of envy for Andromeda and jealousy toward Attis.
Yeah, I think it's clear from her poems that she's satirizing one of her contemporaries. Even if she doesn't give a name, or maybe we don't have this name because we don't have all of her poems. So, and as you mentioned, Attis, maybe I can say that there are 3 girls named in her poems, and those are Attis, Anactoria, and Grinna. We can refer to them as companions or perhaps companion girls. Since these 3 are frequently mentioned in Sappho's poem, they are considered Sappho's favorite companion girls.
Actually, we were a bit hesitant to use the modern terms. They do not correspond exactly to what is there. Calling them students may be correct at some point, but this is not being a student in the modern sense.
That is to say, it doesn't conform the modern concept of schooling and education, nor does it align with the educational practices of ancient Greece. What Sappho does here is not simply teaching these girls basic science or physical activities. Instead, it involves activities such as reading poems together, singing songs, and engaging in rituals associated with gods like Aphrodite and Eros. In essence, Sappho can be regarded as a mentor or guide. It's worth noting that this form of education or schooling is referred as theasos, meaning crown or wreath. This sets it apart from institutions like Plato's Academy, where subjects like geometry and physics were taught. Here, the focus is more on guiding young girls on their journey to womanhood, but also preparing them for marriage.
In fact, preparing for life through poems, dances, and ballads. But there are also similarities with the Hellenic understanding of education, which is the erotic relationship between them.
Yes, we can say that it is very similar in that respect because the homoerotic relationship between young men and their teachers and the homoerotic relationship between Sappho and her girls is very similar. We can say that they both have the mission of educating young women and young men. Of course, at some point I will pass the floor to you. You have more to say. But we can also say that there is a relationship between this older, more mature teacher and the young student. We know from history that there is a sexual relationship between these two men. Sappho was a really important person in her time, and we can see this from the fact that her picture was engraved on vases and even her face was printed on a coin. So when we look at it, the fact that she was printed on a coin and on a vase is an important detail for a woman in that time. On one hand, this also proves her existence. But apart from this, I can also say that Plato is also alleged to have said something like this about Sappho. Plato calls Sappho the 10th muse. Those muses in Greek mythology are traditionally 9 in number. Plato identifies Sappho as the 10th. So, for those who don't know, the muses inspire not only poetry, but also music and all kinds of fields you can think of. And Sappho takes her inspiration from the mountain where the muses live.
Yes, as you said, in the field of education, when we look at the homosexual relationship in the Hellenes, especially in Athens, we see that it is usually between a young man and an older man. These need to be mentioned, especially in the context of Eros, but let's turn our gaze to Sappho. It is already clear in Sappho's poems that she had erotic relations with the girls around her. In Athens, there was an approach that male homosexuality was considered more supreme. In fact, female homosexuality or men's heterosexual relations with women are seen as a bit inferior. I think the importance of Sappho is also revealed at this point. Although it was not considered to be contrary to the Hellenic culture at that time, it was not supported for a married woman to be with other people, as Foucault shows in the History of Sexuality. Even though it was considered ordinary for men to have sex with other people, it was seen as a sublime situation if there was a birth of an idea as a result of this union.
I will restrain myself a bit here. I tend to get a bit angry about this kind of stuff. And so I'm restraining myself and I apologize. Maybe I can add this while I'm interrupting. As you said, of course, a married woman having an affair with someone else is frowned upon, and we know that Sappho was a byway and had a daughter named Clace. We know that from her poems, and maybe it's important to mention here that, as we said before, among them there is a relationship, emotional and sexual. However, Sappho's relationship with these girls is also a teacher-student relationship. She teaches them, prepares them for marriage, and in this sense, she's certainly not against these girls getting married. But we also see that she is jealous. This is actually a very sweet and nice situation, in my opinion.
All of this is connected to Eros. It's very sincere, very impulsive, and that's why jealousy comes naturally. When Sappho was jealous of another woman, as a matter of fact, Sappho was already married, but she says that it hurts her anyway, that the person she's in love with is in the arms of someone else. Of course, we do not know whether they had a relationship afterwards or not, but we know what happened in Athens in the similar situation. In Athens, a man having a homosexual relationship and marrying a woman at the same time would not cause any problems, but the approach to women's sexuality was a bit different. Maybe the erotic relationship between them was also interrupted. We don't know that for sure. It made me think of the beginning of Baudelaire's poem Lesbos. Lesbos, where Phrynes, each to each are plighted, were never yet unanswered, went aside, where Paphos with a rival is requited, and Venus with a Sappho has to vie. Lesbos, where Phrynes, each to each, are plighted. We should talk about what Phryne is. Phryne, a woman famous for her beauty in ancient Athens, who modeled for sculptures of Aphrodite. Although she was sentenced to death for her heresy, it is rumored that she was spared because of her extraordinary beauty. Baudelaire draws such a resemblance between the woman in Lesbos, where Phrynes each to each are plighted. Venus, of course, as you know, is the Roman name of Aphrodite. Despite all Sappho's praise for Aphrodite, in Baudelaire's approach, Aphrodite has to vie of Sappho. Perhaps, yes, it was Aphrodite who was jealous of Sappho, despite all the praise.
On the one hand, Baudelaire shows us the greatness of Sappho in this poem, actually, because he compares her to a goddess. Some people tend to deny the lesbian relationship Sappho has with her companions. The homosexual relationship between men is not something that is denied at that time, but later the relationship between women is denied. And now it's more complicated, so I was just going to compare it now, but it's useless. So maybe we can jump to Sappho's death, actually, which is somehow is linked to the stories about Sappho's heterosexuality and about the denial of her homosexual relationships. So Baudelaire, on one hand, reveals this relationship between women in his verses. So I think it was also important to talk about this.
Then let's talk about Sappho's death, her so-called suicide.
I can talk a little bit about this. First of all, we said at the beginning that we don't know exactly when Sappho died. Therefore, how she died is also unknown. Because there is a difference between the dates given, and those who assume that she died at a later date say that she died of old age. So the story where there is an assumption that she had died at a younger age seems to be a fiction. Well, we think that is a fiction. I can also give a small anecdote that there is such a situation. So Sappho spent most of her life in Lesbos, but we know that due to some political issues, Sappho was exiled to Sicily, to Syracuse. From this, we can also infer something about Sappho's character. We can also think that she may have died away from her home. Without further addition, let me come to another hypothesis about her death, which we think is a fiction. So there is an idea that Sappho committed a suicide, or more precisely, it was first recorded in history in this way in the Hellenistic period. Later in the Roman period, Ovidius compiled a collection of letters written by women to their lovers or loved ones, and there is so-called a letter that is claimed to be Sappho's. This is a letter Sappho wrote to Faun. So we also know that Faun was younger than Sappho. We know that through these letters, because since we believe this story is a fiction, Faun also doesn't exist. We understand from this story that Sappho could not find a response to her love, and at the end of it, she tragically throws herself from the rocks and commits suicide. Well, of course, this is a fictional story.
There's also a play in the 19th century.
Yeah, I will come to that, but before coming to that, I thought I could say this. So first of all, we don't believe in the story. I will also pass on the word to Celine in this subject, but On the other hand, this incident has a poetic aspect, and Baudelaire uses it in his poetry. Maybe after saying a few things, you can read that poem, those verses.
It would be nice, actually. We already know from her poems that Sappho did not have love relationships with men. It seems clear that the situation was changed first in the Hellenistic period, then in Rome, then in Christianity, for obvious reasons. I, especially in Baudelaire's poem Lesbos, think there are similarities between Sappho and Socrates' death. Maybe it makes sense to read these lines first. So, Baudelaire says, "What are to us the laws of the just and unjust, virgins with sublime hearts, honor of these islands? Your religion, like any other, is august, and love will laugh at heaven and at hell. What are to us the laws of the just and unjust?" I was particularly interested in those lines. Your religion, like any other, is august. This reminded me of the trial of Socrates. But I have to say this, I don't think that either Socrates or Sappho were people who were distant from the culture of their period. But it is clear that they brought something new to this culture. And innovation has always faced fear. In every period, it has faced the danger of being alienated and even eliminated if it's possible. What Socrates tried to do was to replace conceptual thought with gods. In Plato's Symposium, after Socrates begins his speech, we even see Socrates trying to explain Eros as a concept. And afterwards, this approach of Socrates would lead to his death, accused of bringing new gods to Athens. This is indeed what Socrates is trying to do. And what are these new gods? Conceptual thought, perhaps logic at some point. This approach of Socrates later be criticized a lot by Nietzsche, and Nietzsche would even go so far as to call Socrates as a despotic logician. Without going any further, let us return to Sappho. And I think Sappho also had a stance against this masculine social structure in the Hellenes. A stance that we can go as far as Baudelaire and say that she brought a new religion. We didn't go into the reasons for her exile to Sicily. However, the reason was that she and Alcaeus attacked a few aristocratic families. That is why they were exiled. Politically speaking, Sappho is very much of a person of action, and there are some poems of her that we can call political and poems about Trojan War either.
Yes, so when I look at it, even her relationship with her girls, her companions, could be considered contrary to beliefs. And it's actually not could be, it is considered contrary to beliefs. She is not only excluded in ancient Greece. Later on, so this fictional death, the fictional death lasting centuries, also shows us how much her homosexuality is tried to be hidden and somehow covered up. Not only in her own time, but also later on, Sappho at some point remains somewhat revolutionary from a feminist perspective. So yes, we cannot talk about a feminism or a feminist perspective at her time, but even looking from now, after 2000 years of her death, this is such a revolutionary act. So I think that's how we can explain Baudelaire's handling of her death from this perspective.
Then I think we can move on to that certain play.
Yep, let's go. Hit it.
Okay. Franz Grillparzer, an Austrian playwright who wrote a play called Sappho in 1880. Elena, you can tell us a little bit about this play.
So, first of all, we can tell you how we came across this play. Actually, we came across this play through an article criticizing the problematic language of this author's play, Sappho. So this play is related to the fictional story we were just talking about. It tells about this supposed relationship between Sappho and Faun, a young man. According to this play, Sappho falls in love with Faun. She introduces him as a very handsome and wise man to those around her. Although those around Sappho don't really agree with that. But Faun does not respond back to her love because she is a great artist, and Faun initially considers himself inferior to Sappho. Later, Faun falls in love with a maid of Sappho named Melita. Of course, this is all in the game and there is no connection to reality. So But Sappho is at first suspicious of this love between Faun and Melita, and then becomes very angry when she realizes that her suspicion is true. She wants to punish Melita for this and take revenge on Faun. So this is what the author wants to do in the play. Sappho as a personification of art and Faun is as life itself. So the point he wants to make is that Sappho wants to transition from representing art to life. She wanted to give up her artistic persona. This is why Faun was both afraid of Sappho and admired her in the first place. And Sappho's desire to take revenge on Melita and Faun is portrayed as a situation pushes Sappho away from this artistic persona into being human, actually. So what we are criticizing at this point is that the author's portrayal of Sappho as a woman who wants revenge, who is very jealous, and who could even expel Melita from the island. I see this as an effort to prove that Sappho is heterosexual. Sappho, as far as we know, is already married and has a homoerotic relationship with companions, with girls. So according to this story, Sappho is jealous of Faun and burns the ground, while we are not even sure about the existence of a character called Faun. So of course, the end of the story ends like the end of the story in ancient Greece. Sappho could not bear Faun running away with Melita, and she commits a suicide by throwing herself off the cliff. So how dramatic.
This story does not match at all with the Sappho we know from her poems. There are many things to criticize, but I would like to give the floor to Sappho herself on this subject. There is a very short line from one of her poems, and I believe if she had seen this play, she would have said this. She says, "On vengeance, no, my heart is lenient." Sappho's anger will not turn into rage, and the situation will not become that tragic. At least this is what Sappho says about herself, and this is what we take as a guide.
Yeah, so we prefer to believe in Sappho. Obviously. Although Sappho makes herself look more innocent than she really is in this poem. In this line, actually. So she is obviously a political character, a little bit of combative character who was sent into exile. I'm not saying this in the sense of right or wrong. That is for sure that she is not someone like in this play.
Yes, probably she's not. Because she has already been through many loves, she prepares them all for marriage. I also realized that we talk so much, but we never mentioned Aphrodite, which was an important goddess that we should talk about in Sappho's case already.
Yes, indeed. Let me briefly explain why it's important. So Sappho, as far as we know, is said to have written 10,000 verses. What we have are around 600. So we don't even have 10% of what she wrote. We have access to very, very few of them, and these are the ones we have either through papyrus or through translators. But there is one of her poems, this for sure, that has reached us in its entirety. Sappho's Ode to Aphrodite. This is indeed a very important poem.
Elena, a very important aspect is the inscriptions on pottery. The ones that came with papyrus were written by scribes during the Roman era. Therefore, they don't seem very reliable because they contain many additions in it. I believe the inscriptions on pottery or other materials from that era, like the ones we've been discussing, seems more reliable. This poem has been given the title Ode to Aphrodite, but Sappho did not give it that name herself. The scribes of the ancient times give that name. There are a few things I want to mention about this poem, but first let's talk a little bit about Aphrodite. There are two myths about Aphrodite's birth. One is from Hesiod's Theogony. According to Hesiod, before everything there was Chaos. Then Gaia and Uranus were born. Gaia is feminine and means earth, and Uranus is sky and it is masculine. Uranus, afraid of the children born from the union of Uranus and Gaia, and puts them inside Gaia. In other words, he buries them in the ground. After burying them in the ground, Gaia suffers in pain, swells up, and with the pain she feels, she gives her last child, Kronos, a sickle. With this sickle, Kronos cuts the testicles of his father, Uranus, and throws them into the sea, and when they fell into the sea, Aphrodite rises with the foam. And you can see the picture of this moment in Botticelli's famous painting, The Birth of Venus. Now this myth is based on Hesiod's narrative. There's also another myth told by Homer. In that myth, Aphrodite is the child of Zeus and Dione. Both of those myths have their own significance, and this is revealed in Plato's Symposium. In Symposium, Pausanias said that the existence of two different Aphrodite myths was related to the existence of two different loves. Aphrodite, who was born from the testicles of Uranus, was a goddess who did not have a mother and was not born from sexual intercourse. The other Aphrodite is a goddess born out of the sexual relations of Zeus and Dione. In Symposium, they make a distinctive between those two. Aphrodite, born of Zeus, represents a love that is considered inferior to Aphrodite, born of Uranus, whom they call celestial. Let's say it symbolizes the expression of a purely physical love, arising from the pleasures of people. Aphrodite, which comes from Uranus and is therefore celestial, symbolizes love that causes thoughts to be born. In Symposium, Diotima and Socrates will talk about giving birth to thought in the rest of the dialogue. But when we look at Pausanias in particular, we can say that the bodily pleasures symbolized by the love of Aphrodite, the daughter of Zeus, point to the Hellenic bisexual relationship. Unfortunately, the approach I'm talking about here is only based on men in Symposium. While only for the sake of pleasure, the sexual relationship of a man, whether with a woman or a man, refers to the fact that it is only a physical production. On the other hand, what the celestial Aphrodite represents is the homosexual relationship between men, which also includes an intellectual sharing. This is an erotic relationship that leads to mutual creation. It is a relationship that arises from the older man's desire for the younger man and their desire to raise and teach them. This is a relationship similar to Sappho's relationship with the woman around her. Looking at this duality mentioned by Pausanias, it seems to me that Sappho addressing Aphrodite in her poem as the daughter of Zeus, rather than the one born of Uranus, is worth talking about a bit. I'm not sure if this is an interpretation taken too far, but as Pausanias points out, there's a masculine emphasis in the love represented by Aphrodite, which is born out of Uranus. When Sappho speaks of Aphrodite in this poem, did she deliberately choose Homer's myth against this masculine theme? We do not know, but I believe it is worth mentioning. Another issue I think is worth discussing is Eros. I'm going to talk about a few things about Eros, and that might be important only in the context of Sappho, since we are talking about an erotic relationship between Sappho and the girls around her. So the first thing I would recommend to anyone listening to us is Plato's Symposium. Because what were they deciding there in the first place? To praise Eros. And everyone starts praising Eros one by one. Actually, Eros is not a god who borns from the Titans like Zeus and the other gods. Eros exists at the very beginning of the universe like Uranus and Gaia. Uranus is sky, Gaia is earth, we mentioned them before, and Eros is love and harmony. The fact that Eros is at the very beginning of the universe in Hellenic thought shows us that there cannot be a universe without love. There cannot be a universe without harmony. In fact, Eryximachos, who was a physician at Symposium, was telling us that the organs within the human being can work well and coexist with Eros, which means with love, with harmony. Of course, this kind of love is also Eros, but when we think of concepts such as love and affection in the modern sense, we have to be a little bit careful when we use them in order not to be anachronistic. As we move towards the end of the symposium, when it is Socrates' turn, the tone of praise changes a bit, and Socrates, as we are used to doing, analyzes symbolizes these gods as concepts. Socrates says that Eros cannot be a god because Eros desires. For every desire is born out of imperfection, and imperfection is not fitting for the gods. Therefore, Socrates says Eros is at best a daimon. So, what is this daimon? In its most simplified form, daimons are beings that enable humans that communicate with the deities. But what is the significance of this in the context of Sappho? To understand this, let us recall only a few words remained from her poem. That is my servant Eros and you. Sappho is telling us this line as if Aphrodite was saying it to Sappho. But it is interesting that in this verse, not only Sappho is servant, but also Eros is Aphrodite's servant. So can we build an analogy between Socrates and Sappho in this context? Two different eras, a philosopher and a poet. Of course, we don't have much time to discuss this in this podcast, but why not later with those who are listening to us? Then I can finally say this, Sappho was a great poet who struggled with her music, with her poems, with her lyre, in a culture, in a masculine society where the myth of Medusa existed. I hope we were able to honor this great poet 2500, 2600 years later after her life.
So, as you mentioned, we don't have much time to discuss more, and we also need to conclude this podcast at some point. And from our experience, from the Turkish version of this podcast, we have a huge problem with this, with ending things. So therefore, I won't say much more on top of what you said, because I think you've already explained it very well. Maybe I can make one or two comments. I think we agree on which Aphrodite she used anyway. Here she used Aphrodite, who is a goddess, and praised her instead of the story that confines the goddess Aphrodite to a patriarchal boundary. So in this sense, I think it's really remarkable. Also, you mentioned Medusa very briefly, or you mentioned her name more accurately. So what Sappho did is really valuable. Sappho's existence is really valuable, because although Lesbos is a place where women have more of their own spaces and can move more freely, at some point this did not save Sappho from being trapped in patriarchal patterns. I'm not talking about Sappho's own actions in this context. What is said about Sappho's death later, placing her in a context that confines her to a heterosexual relationship and refusing to see her and her relationships with her companions in this context, actually shows how not free she and her companions were, and how difficult was to exist at that time as a very prominent figure in history. So her relationship with her girls are the same. At that time, we know that women rarely received education. It can be said that culturally it was really a nurturing education and poetry. So it was really precious when we looked at the general situation of the time. These were the most important reasons why we chose Sappho. She was a woman ahead of her time. She made great contributions to the literary world in terms of poetry. This woman, who is the founder of lyrical poetry, who has her own prosody and talks about her own feelings, and is among the first to do so, is certainly well known in certain communities, but we wanted to expand it a little bit more. Of course, we wanted to contribute to this as much as we could. We are aware of our limits, and we wanted to publicize it more. Well, this is sort of a confession, but we wanted to take Sappho on our side as an inspiration, because she's a very powerful woman and she symbolizes something in terms of feminism. As mentioned before, we cannot talk about the feminism as a concept at that time, but looking from today's perspective, she is really an important person in terms of feminism, as I can say. In this podcast, we wanted to represent her both because we liked her poems very much, and because she was little known as a woman, well, looking at the general. And maybe her value was not seen because of this. So another thing to mention is, we actually mentioned this from time to time, we talked about women's sexuality. In ancient Greece, we said that men are more free, well, the relationship that Sappho and her companions are in is a very brave and actually a relationship that resists the system. So in this sense, we believe that Sappho is really valuable. As I am coming to an end, hopefully, fingers crossed, I would also like to mention something that Céline mentioned. So she talks about Troy. So Sappho has a poem about the Trojan War. So as Céline also says, Sappho prefers to look at love in the Trojan War. Of course, she has a political side too. We see that she's a political person in her own life. We talked about some rebellious activities she made and she being exiled, etc., etc. So her trying to look at beauty in the Trojan War, looking at the peace atmosphere before the war, not creating an epic piece from the war, approaching it from another perspective seemed really valuable to me. I wanted to mention this too. I'm not saying this in relation to any war in particular because, well, when we started this podcast 2 years ago, I think there was like whole another conflict or war, whatever, in this hideous world. But now, like just today, talking about looking from these different perspectives, focusing on the beauties that we have is really relevant, honestly. So what I want to mention here is, just like Sappho did, to approach from different perspectives, etc., but not in a naive way, because we know that she's political. So this...
So are we.
Exactly. So I tend to call it being on the right side of the history, somehow. Well, I don't know. I believe there's always a chance to write a heroic story from like an epic, from a war, from a conflict. That is probably the easiest thing. But I think it's also super important to see other beauties and to see the destructiveness of war. So I wanted to mention this. Well, it is because what we do in this podcast, we share our ideas. It doesn't matter if we just talk about something cultural, like something, I don't know, poetry, music, like everything is political for us, and we don't separate these concepts from one to the other. As we said in this section, so we wanted to introduce Sappho a little bit. We wanted to talk about the period she lived in ancient Greece. Céline discussed Aphrodite and Eros. So we have drawn a little more general framework about Sappho, and we wanted to contribute to spreading her poetry, even if it's a small contribution. But after all, well, there is actually, this will also surprise Céline. I want to read a little poem. So it is said that Sappho wrote this, and she says, which is very nice actually, I declare that later on, even in an age unlike our own, someone will remember who we are. Guess what, Sappho? We have a goddamn podcast inspired by you. So
2,500 years later.
Exactly. So yeah, well, in our first podcast, we were discussing at the end of this episode, at the end of this very episode actually, like the same information, etc., that we don't know where this podcast will go, but after 2 years, we can confidently say that it will go everywhere. There's no such theme in this podcast. We talk about everything that we want to talk about to each other, actually. Okay, so I really promised to my cousin, Céline, that I will not make it longer and I will not be emotional, which is quite cruel from her side, but whatever. So yeah, as I said, we just want our podcast to continue. We will definitely have like some people actually to talk with, so it will not be just our own precious ideas. I think these are my final words for our first podcast. I hope it was a nice listening for you, and I hope everything was clear, and I hope it inspired you a bit, because we want Sappho to inspire everyone. And I hope to be able to talk to you in the following episodes. Thank you so much for listening us.